Good morning, afternoon and evening everyone. Today is Monday, it's the start of a new week, worst day of the week I'm afraid, but we have to go through it one way or another. Today we are going through another thing we have been missing for a few days, over 10 days, almost 2 weeks in fact, which is Mythic Plus. Now, there isn't really much to check on Mythic Plus anymore, as we have gotten more or less the same thing for a few weeks by now. However, we are getting close to Season 4. So we are getting close to the moment where we jump from one season to the next, when there might be some changes, some movement in the meta that is going to translate from one season to the next. Obviously, unfortunately, up to this point, we haven't really gotten that many news about balance tuning. I have started my campaign about requesting from Blizzard some balance tuning to happen before Season 4 begins. We do have the confirmation that Destruction and Survival will be nerfed, but that's basically all we have. So I'm wishing for more as we get into Season 4, because it's going to shake things up way more. It's going to make things way more exciting as we get into Season 4. So for the moment, when it comes to looking at what's going on in Mythic Plus, not really much of anything is changing. If we had to look at this from the outlook, from the perspective of what's going to happen in Season 4, when we look at the tanks, despite the usual very good situation when it comes to the balance in most keys, in keys that most players will do, so this is the spread of all tanks in all keys. It's very nice, it's very cool, it's very balanced. Once you get into keys in the 20 range, we of course see a slight drop of the spec to the left, which doesn't really matter. Most of the other tanks are still very well balanced, and you know, keys in the 20 and up range are still done by less than 2% of the player base, and it is still this balanced. It only gets quite one-sided, quite lopsided once you get into the highest of keys in the 25 plus range, where Blood Death Knight is the popular pick. And this is what we are talking about for Season 4, and why balancing would be welcome in Season 4, because unlike any other season that we have gotten before, we are not getting a season with plenty of changes. We are not getting a season, for example, like Season 3, like this season, like Sepulcher, where we know that, for example, oh, neat, we are getting double legendaries, plus we are also getting tier sets. So we don't know, you know, it's a mystery which specs will become meta, which specs will become great. It's all about how well they will scale with their tier set, how well they will scale with their double legendary powers. So before the season begins, as the previous season is ending, there is plenty of room for players to think, to guess, to fantasize about which spec to play for the next season, because a lot of it is going to be shrouded in mystery. This is not really going to be the same thing for Season 4, however, if we don't get any balance tuning, because if we don't get any balance tuning, then there is no reason to expect anything to change in the tank options. It's gonna be Brewmaster and Blood Death Knight in Mythic Raiding, and it's gonna be Blood Death Knight in Mythic Plus. We're gonna get the same things. We're still gonna get the same tier sets, the same legendary powers, no balance tuning extra, so no reason to expect the dominance of Blood Death Knight to change at the beginning of Season 4. For healers, the situation is more or less the same. When we look at the entirety of the heal population, it's actually quite interesting. We have 3 different specs, all very close to each other in terms of popularity in all keys. Things start getting more on the side of Resto, Shaman and Holy Priest in the keys higher than 20. I was wondering whether or not Priest was going to end the season by passing Resto Shaman, but it looks like it's not going to be the case for Season 3. Even when we go in the highest level of keys in the 25 plus range, it is still Resto Shaman being ahead. This, once again, looking at this with the perspective of Season 4, looks like it's going to be a much stronger start for Holy Priest. In case you don't know, Holy Priest has been pretty much irrelevant for its entire existence in Mythic Plus. It was never played as a meta spec in Mythic Plus, including Shadowlands. Season 1 and Season 2, Holy Priest was awful in Mythic Plus. It only became a thing in Season 3, which meant that it took Holy Priest a lot longer to get going, a lot longer to be considered a meta spec. Discipline was already quite bad in Mythic Plus. You didn't have many priests pushing Mythic Plus keys, so Holy Priest took quite a lot of time to get popular, to the point that even now they still weren't able to pass Resto Shaman. However, in Season 4, if things are not changing, then it is much more likely that Holy Priest will be the more popular healer from the get-go. in Mythic Plus. There's not going to be a wandering period, a question mark period of a couple of months at the start of the season like it happened in Season 3 for players to start playing Holy Priest. Now, at the start of Season 4, it will be known from the get-go that Holy Priest is very good, so it is likely that Holy Priest will be from the start passing and being above Resto Shaman in Mythic Plus keys. It's still, by the way, since this discussion only matters for 0.1% of the Mythic Plus player base, Resto Shaman is still the better healer in Mythic Plus when it comes to 99.9% of the player base, because it is a much better healer for pugs. It is a much better healer for groups without coordination and for groups without pre-planned pulls of trash mobs. It's much easier to fix the mistakes of the group as a Resto Shaman than it is for a Holy Priest, for example. It's much easier to have consistent damage with Vesper Totem for a Resto Shaman than to round up huge pulls with Boon of the Ascended for Holy Priest. So even if I'm talking about Holy Priest being more popular from the get-go in Season 4, it would still mostly be about the highest level of players. The majority of the player base will still likely stick with Resto Shaman in the end. Where we do see some possible changes, on the other hand, is in the only two roles, the melee and the ranged of the DPS, where we already know there is going to be some balance tuning, because we do know survival is getting nerfed and we do know destruction is getting nerfed. When it comes to the melee DPS, we have seen the dominance of Survival Hunter, which has almost gotten to 40% in the highest level of keys. However, survival is not quite as popular as Destruction Warlock for ranged DPS. Perhaps it is because survival was never a good spec in Mythic Plus, or never a good spec ever, so the amount of players willing to reroll to survival is much lower, or perhaps it is because there are a couple of specs, in particularly one spec, which is close to the level of survival, while not passing it, but still close, which is Windwalker. So once we start looking at this once again in the perspective, in the prospect of Season 4, the most logical answer is going to be, we don't know what nerf survival is receiving, but if we can assume that the nerf is going to be big enough to knock them down a peg, to knock them down a level, then the most logical assumption is going to be that Windwalker is going to be taking the place of survival. So it's simply going to be a swap. The number 2 currently melee DPS spec, Windwalker, will simply be passing the number 1 spec. That seems to be the most logical assumption for the moment for melee DPS. This is made particularly harder by the fact that with just 8-9 days left to the release of Season 4, we don't even know which type of nerf survival is receiving. We do know it's a nerf, we do know it's a nerf to their AoE, but we still have heard nothing yet from Blizzard, which is quite worrying, to be honest. The situation in the choice of the ranged DPS is somewhat similar, but with a handful more options, or rather one more option, really. Destruction has been an abomination the entire tier. Destruction has ramped up to, at the moment, 53.3% representation in the higher level of keys. So once we assume that this 20 to 25% AoE nerf given to Destruction, particularly in the higher pull count of trash mobs, if we assume that this is enough to knock them down from their meta spot, which, by the way, I don't believe it will. I know it sounds ridiculous, but nerfing them by 25% in AoE damage would still make them the strongest AoE spec in the game anyways. That's how busted they have been in Season 3. But let's just assume they do knock down themselves a bit after the nerfs. The follow-ups of Destructions are going to likely be Demonology and Fire Mage. Demonology is in the same class, so it's going to be very easy for all of the Destro locks, all of the Flavor of the Month rerollers to simply stick to Warlock and move to Demo, which is by no means a bad spec in Mythic Plus. It's just been overshadowed by Destruction, but it is still quite solid. And then Fire. Of course, Fire always finds a way to become meta in Mythic Plus because their combustion window is so powerful in terms of burst damage. They have been, at the moment, as you can see, quite tied with Frost Mage, but at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, when you really need one range spec, usually Fire Mage always takes over Frost because of their much stronger cooldown window compared to Frost Mage. Frost Mage effectively doesn't have a cooldown window, whereas Fire Mage is much better to be played around on their combustion. So these are the situations which seem to be set in stone for most of these roles, because for healers with no balance tuning, it's very likely that Holy Priest will just overtake Resto Shaman, and Resto Shaman will still be there as a second spec. For tanks, it's gonna be again Blood Death Knight for another season, and for melee DPS, it's gonna be Survival. If the nerf is big enough, then it's gonna be Windwalker. Same goes for ranged. It's still gonna be Destrolock. If the nerf is going to be enough to knock them down, it's gonna be surpassed by Fire Mage and perhaps even Demo Lock. These are going to be more or less the situations we can see in Season 4. The fact that we haven't gotten that many news is kind of worrying. Yes, of course, Blizzard is very busy right now with Dragonflight stuff, obviously, but still, the fact that nothing yet is to be heard about Season 4 is quite, at the very least, peculiar and weird. I think it's quite interesting, the situation we are in right now when it comes to meta, when it comes to choosing what to play and, you know, thinking about what to play, because we are in a very interesting situation compared to pretty much all of the other previous expansions. Because when you go back in time, you look at Nyalota from BFA, you look at Hellfire, Citadel from Warlords, you look at even older things like Siege of Orgrimmar from Mist. All of these last raids lasted for a year or more. 12 months, 14 months season. So by the end of the season, by the start of the next expansion, the alpha and then the beta of the next expansion, the game was very stale, right? There was basically no more content for months and months and months before the release of the next expansion. Now we are in a very unique situation where Season 4 is being released just 4 months away from the release of the next expansion. So choosing what to play, starting to try out different classes and different specs is going to have a much stronger impact than what it had before. If you started to play, for example, to reroll to a new class in February for Nyalota, for example, in PFA, you still had some 9 months to go, some 10 months to go before the release of the next expansion in Shadowlands. But this Season 4 is going to be much closer to the release of Shadowlands. It's not that once you finish Season 4, once you get your raid clear, once you reach your goals in Mythic Plus, you're like, nice. Now I can quit WoW, you know, I can go play some other games for like 8 months before the next expansion comes out. If you finish Season 4, you finish what you wanted to do in Season 4 by the start of November, and in a month the expansion comes out. So it's a much tighter timeline, it's a much smaller window for a pause in between the last season and the start of the next expansion, which is why I think, you know, choosing what to play, getting to test the new classes and new specs, perhaps even into the pre-patch of Dragonflight, if the pre-patch is going to give us the new talents, for example, might be quite, you know, quite important for your choice of what's next to play in the next expansion. I thought it was going to be interesting and quite nice if Blizzard laid down a coat of balance tuning for the last season, just knock down all of the overperforming specs like Blood Death Knight, Holy Priest or Destrolocks, and then buff all of the others to just spread the player base to as many specs as possible before the release of Dragonflight. But it looks like it's not happening for now, which would be quite sad for the next season. As I said, I am quite excited to be pushing keys in Season 4 because of all the old new dungeons being reproposed to us in Season 4, but at the same time, as soon as I am excited about that, I am reminded that I will very likely have to play with Blood Death Knight, Destrolock, Survival Hunter and Windwalker Monk for most of the season, which will depress me a little bit because I have grown quite a bit tired of seeing the exact same specs for several months now. That was my wish after this recap of Mythic Plus for pretty much the second to last week of Mythic Plus of this season, to see some balance tuning before the release of Season 4. I'm still hoping there's still room to be hooked on our Hopium tanks and hope that we get some changes before Season 4 begins. I'm still gonna play Season 4 and be happy to try out those dungeons, as well as the meme fated raids that are going to happen, and being able to get best in slot weapons or trinkets after just 2 or 3 weeks is also going to be a pretty cool change of pace compared to what we have had so far. Still, it could all have been made better if we had some more variety in the choices of specs to play and to see meta, to see competitive at a high level. this was the main point for today, recapping what's been going on in Mythic Plus and what's likely to happen in Season 4 if the balancing stays as it is for the next and last season of Shadowlands. With this being said, it's time to leave each other. A thank and a round of applause as usual to all of my patrons supporting me. It's very nice to be supported in these busy times for WoW content as we get into the alpha, which still, for the record, I do not have, and then eventually into the beta. There's going to be more and more content to follow through, so it's nice to know that I have your support as I go through all of this content to deliver to you. Also, of course, you can like and comment down below to support me even more, as well as subscribing obviously to the channel, which is kind of the goal of a YouTube channel. And then as a last point, you can follow me on Twitter. If you're getting fatigued in reading the same impressions farming or sponsored tweets constantly, you can follow me for some 174 IQ takes about the game and subscribing to my Patreon as the ultimate tier of supporting me and my channel, which will give you access, of course, to my Discord server as well. If you ever want to have a chat, ask some questions, give some feedback or whatever else, I am usually always available to be reached on Discord as well. With this being said, now we are leaving. Thank you guys for watching, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, well, look at it this way. It's just a couple of days left, apparently, to this heat wave, so I'm hoping I'm not getting debated from my weather forecast, and it does effectively get a little bit more chilly in the next weeks. Please,